No man ever wanted to touch me. The words slipped from Lila Mae's mouth before she even realized she'd spoken them. They floated into the cold night air, vanishing with the trail of smoke rising from the saloon chimney. She clutched, her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the thin wool no match for the bite of late autumn wind sweeping across the town of Dry Creek. Dust skittered across the street, whispering against the warped wood of the saloon porch where she stood. Inside, men laughed too loud, mugs clattered, and the piano banged out a crook tune, but out here, Lila Mae felt like a ghost. She always did. The lantern light spilling through the cracked saloon windows caught her in a cruel half-glow, as if even fire refused to embrace her fully. At 23, she carried the weight of twice her years. Her once bright hair, the color of ripe wheat, had dulled beneath months of neglect. Her dress, plain and mended, bore stains the washboard could never beat out. But her eyes, those storm-gray eyes, still held something untamed. Though most folks never looked long enough to notice, the men of Dry Creek saw her as a walking curse. At 16, she'd been married to a ranch hand twice her age, a man who treated her more like hired help than a wife. By 18, she was a widow, his body crushed beneath a spooked stallion. Whispers spread faster than wildfire. Some said she'd bewitched the horse. Others said the Almighty himself was punishing her. When her womb bore no child from the brief marriage, the gossip hardened into stone. Barren, cursed, unwanted. No man touched her hand at the mercantile. No man tipped his hat when she passed. If they looked at all, it was with disdain or mockery. And so, standing on that porch with her shawl drawn tight, Lila Mae believed what the town had taught her, that she was destined to live and die untouched. Unseen, unloved, she stared into the night, past the street where lanterns flickered, past the corral where horses snorted and stamped, to the edge of the open land where darkness pooled like ink. It was there that she saw him. At first, she thought her tired eyes had conjured a mirage. A lone figure stood at the border of town, where the tall prairie grass brushed the desert. The moon traced his outline, cutting him from the shadows in sharp relief. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, bare-chested despite the chill. Firelight flickered at his feet. He'd built a small blaze, its glow dancing against the planes of his body. Her breath caught. He was unlike the cowhands who swaggered through Dry Creek. His presence did not swagger. It commanded. His long, black hair spilled across his chest, catching hints of silver from the moon. Around his neck hung strands of bone and turquoise, tribal beads that seemed to pulse with the fire's glow. His skin, bronzed and scarred, spoke of battles fought beneath harsher suns than this. Yet his stillness, hands resting loosely at his sides, gaze fixed on the flames, spoke of patience, control, and quiet strength. Lila Mae's heart drummed. Against her ribs, a wild and unwelcome rhythm. What was a man like that doing here, at the edge of a town that would sooner spit at him than offer bread? Every tale she'd ever heard told her to turn away, to keep walking, to ignore what her gut stirred inside her chest. Yet something stronger than caution rooted her to the spot, and then he lifted his head. His eyes found hers across the distance, and for the first time in her life, Lila Mae did not feel invisible. Those eyes, dark as midnight rivers, did not carry suspicion like the townsman's. They did not weigh or measure her as if she were something to be bargained. They did not pity. They saw. The air thickened, heavy with something unnamed. The rowdy laughter from inside the saloon dimmed. The creak of swinging doors, the clatter of boots, all of it faded. In that moment, there was no town, no curse, no whispers, only the fire between them and the question burning inside her chest. Her lips parted, though she had no words prepared. And for the first time in many long, lonely years, Lila Mae wondered if fate had finally shifted or if she had just stepped closer to her ruin. The prairie wind carried the faint crackle of burning wood, and with it the scent of smoke and sage. Lila May stood frozen on the porch, her shawl pulled so tightly across her chest it pressed into her ribs. She wasn't sure if she trembled, from the cold or from the way her eyes refused to leave the man at the edge of town. He was not like the others. Every man she had ever known carried his presence like a whip snapping, loud, meant to make others bow their heads. But this man stood as though the world itself made room for him. Bare-chested in the cold, his bronze skin caught the glow of the fire like hammered copper. The shadows carved his muscles into hard, unyielding lines, but it wasn't brute force. She saw. No, it was something steadier, older, like stone that had endured storms without breaking. The turquoise and bone beads hanging from his neck gleamed in the firelight, each piece whispering of a people and history that Dry Creek had long tried to erase. His long black hair spilled over his shoulders in thick strands, shifting slightly whenever the breeze stirred. But it was his eyes, those dark, watchful eyes that rooted her in place. He was looking straight at her. Lila May swallowed hard, her throat dry as sand. The saloon doors banged open behind her, spilling out a wave of raucous laughter and the sour smell of whiskey. A pair of ranch hands stumbled past, one giving her a crooked grin before muttering to the other, "Crazy Lila staring at nothing." Again. Their boots crunched on the dirt as they wandered off, too drunk to notice the figure beyond the fire. But he noticed. The warrior did not move as the men passed, did not shrink back into the tall grass. He simply remained still, eyes locked on her, as if waiting to see whether she would look away. Lila May's pulse drummed against her skin, louder than the piano inside, louder than the wind, louder than anything. She tried to remind herself of the stories. The preacher's voice came back to her, warning of savages lurking at the edges of decent towns, the words sharp as barbed wire. Mothers pulled their children away when such men passed. Fathers rested their hands on their rifles. Even whispering about them in the mercantile earned you stares. But standing here, staring across the empty street, Lila May felt no fear. Instead, she felt. Seen out her feet carried her forward before her mind gave permission. She stepped off the porch, the wooden boards groaning under her weight. The dirt crunched beneath her worn shoes, each step deliberate, reckless, unstoppable. She barely breathed as the distance between them thinned, the lanterns of the saloon fading behind her. The warmth of the fire growing closer. When she was near enough to hear the quiet hiss of the flames, she stopped. Her voice, weak from disuse, somehow found a way past her lips. "Why do you stand apart?" she asked. Her words hung in the air, fragile as glass. She hadn't expected to speak, hadn't prepared for the sound of her own voice carrying into the open night. Yet she couldn't take them back, couldn't retreat. She had asked. The warrior didn't answer right away. He lifted his chin slightly, studying her as though measuring not her face, but her soul. His eyes searched the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl, the lines sorrow had carved into her. Finally, his voice came, deep and steady, like water running over stone. "Because apart is safer for me." "For you?" His words brushed over her skin like smoke, mysterious, warning, but not cruel. Lila May's chest ached at the sound of them, though she couldn't explain why. She wanted to laugh, to spit, to turn away, but all she managed was a cracked whisper. "Safe?" Her throat burned as her voice broke. "No man's hand ever touched me gentle. No man wanted me enough to try." The confession slipped from her lips before she could cage it. She hated herself for saying it, hated the weakness it revealed. But once it left her, the night seemed to hold its breath. The warrior's gaze sharpened, his jaw tightening as if her words cut deep into him. His chest rose, slow and deliberate, the firelight tracing the scars across his skin. And then, in a voice that rang with a promise more powerful than any oath she had ever heard, he spoke, "Then I'll want you enough for them all." The words slammed into her, leaving her unsteady, trembling. Her knees nearly buckled, but she held herself upright, clinging to the weight of what he'd just said. In the silence that followed, the fire crackled louder, and for the first time in her life, Leela May felt the strange, terrifying stirrings of hope. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky, but neither of them moved. Lila May's hands clutched the edges of her shawl, her knuckles white, her body taut as a bowstring. The warrior stood across from her, still as stone, the firelight painting his skin in bronze and shadow. His eyes, dark, unyielding, held hers with a weight that made the world feel smaller, as though nothing existed outside that patch of dirt and flame. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might shake her to the ground. She'd never stood so close to a man like him, never dared. His presence filled the night air like a storm waiting to break. Her chest rose and fell quickly, breaths shallow and uneven. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to retreat, to the safety of her lonely shack, to slip into the role she had played for years, unseen, unwanted, unremarkable. But she didn't move. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice ragged with fear and something far more dangerous, hope. The warrior's gaze didn't waver. His lips parted slightly, his voice rolling low and deep, carrying across the crackling fire. "I walk where others do not. It keeps me alive, keeps you alive too." The words pricked at her, both warning and promise. Lila May's throat tightened, and before she could stop herself, laughter broke from her lips, harsh, brittle, closer to a sob. She pressed a hand against her mouth, but it was too late. The truth poured out, sharp and raw, unspooling like thread cut loose. "Alive?" she echoed, her voice shaking. "Do you think I feel alive? No man's hand ever touched me gentle. No man wanted me enough to try." The confession shattered the silence, carried into the night where only the fire and the prairie grass bore witness. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. It was the kind of truth you buried deep where no one could use it to wound you. But here, before this man who looked at her as if she were more than her scars, the words slipped free like blood from a cut. The warrior's expression changed, though not in the way she feared. There was no smirk, no pity. His jaw tightened. His chest rose with a slow, deliberate breath, and his eyes darkened with something fierce, something uncheckable. He stepped closer to the fire, its glow climbing higher across his chest, revealing the marks of battles etched into his skin. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with tension, so heavy that Lila May thought she might collapse beneath it. She wanted to take the words back, to swallow them whole, but they hung between them like smoke, impossible to gather again. Finally, his voice came, steady as stone, sharp as a blade. "Then I'll want you enough for them all." The air seemed to shatter with the weight of his promise. Lila May's breath caught in her throat. She felt the ground shift beneath her feet, as though his words alone had tilted the earth on its axis. Her knees threatened to buckle, her hands trembled inside her shawl, but she couldn't look away. What do you mean?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. His eyes held hers, unwavering. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, until she could see the fire reflected in the depths of his gaze. "They do not see you. They do not want you. They do not deserve to." His voice deepened, each word carrying the weight of conviction. "But I see, I want, I will." The tears she had buried for years pressed hot at the corners of her eyes, threatening to spill. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not her husband, not the preacher, not a soul in Dry Creek. No one had ever looked at her as if she were worth wanting, worth claiming, worth anything. Her lips parted, trembling, but no sound came out. The warrior's words wrapped around her like a vow, frightening and yet strangely comforting, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the wind wouldn't let you fall. She drew a shaky breath, struggling to steady herself. "Why me?" she asked at last, the question breaking from her in a whisper of desperation. "Why not any other?" His gaze softened, though the intensity never left. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her deeply before answering. Then his words came, slow and deliberate. "Because they are blind, and I see." The fire crackled louder, the flames bending in the wind, as if the earth itself bore witness to the vow that had just been spoken. And standing there, trembling under the weight of his gaze, Leela May realized the truth she'd spent her whole life running from. She was no longer invisible. The world seemed to collapse into the space between them. The fire hissed and popped. The prairie grass swayed in the cold night breeze, but Leela May barely noticed. Every nerve in her body felt alive, lit like lanterns along a dark road. She stood trembling, clutching her shawl as if it could shield her from the weight of his words. "Then I'll want you enough for them all." Her knees wobbled. The air was too thick, her breaths too shallow. She had spent her life wrapped in emptiness, convinced she was untouchable, unwanted, cursed. To hear a man not only defy that belief but speak against it with such certainty shook her to her very bones. And then he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped around the fire. The flames licked at his bronze skin, shadows sliding across the broad plains of his chest, highlighting scars etched by battles long past. His long black hair swayed against his shoulders, catching glints of moonlight. Every step seemed to echo inside her, deep and heavy, as if the earth itself marked his approach. Leela May's breath hitched. She wanted to retreat, to turn and flee back to the familiar loneliness of her shack, but her feet refused to obey. Something deeper held her rooted in place, the pull of his gaze, the vow in his voice, the strange flicker of belonging that tugged inside her chest. When he stood before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, her heart hammered so hard she pressed a hand against her ribs to hold it still. His height dwarfed her, his shadow falling over her like a shelter. He lifted his hand, slow as dawn creeping over the hills, giving her every chance to step back, to turn away, to refuse, but she didn't. His fingers brushed her cheek. The touch was rough, calloused from years of bowstrings and blades, yet careful, so achingly careful that she thought she might break from the tenderness of it. Her breath caught in her throat, tears springing hot to her eyes. No man had ever touched her like this. Not even her husband, who had treated her body as duty, never as something precious. She leaned into his palm before she realized it, her eyes fluttering shut as if savoring a warmth she thought she would never know. Her skin tingled beneath his hand, her whole body alive in ways she could not name. "Why me?" The words slipped out, fragile and desperate, her voice cracking under the weight of them. "Why would you want me when no one else does?" His thumb traced lightly along her cheekbone, and when she opened her eyes, his gaze pinned her where she stood. Dark, steady, unflinching. "Because they were blind," he said, his voice low, steady as stone. "But I see." The words hit her harder than any insult she had ever endured. They unraveled something inside her that she had wound tight for years, a knot of shame, grief, loneliness. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, hot against his hand. She hated crying in front of anyone, but with him she couldn't stop. Her body trembled, and before she knew it, she whispered again, "I don't know how to be wanted." His brow furrowed, his hand sliding to cradle her jaw. "Then I will show you," he said. The firelight danced in his eyes as though it too bowed to the vow in his voice. The night wrapped around them, thick with silence but alive with feeling. Lila May's heart ached, not with the sharpness of rejection, but with the unfamiliar heaviness of being seen, being held, being chosen. She felt like the fire itself, something fragile that could be snuffed out, yet burning brighter than she ever thought possible. Her hand, shaking, lifted from her shawl and hovered uncertainly before settling against his chest. His skin was warm, his heartbeat steady beneath her palm. She gasped softly, as if the reality of him, the solid, living proof of his words, was almost too much to bear. For the first time in her life, she did not feel invisible. For the first time, she did not feel cursed. She felt like a woman, alive and whole, standing in the gaze of a man who would not turn away. And as his touch lingered on her cheek, tender and unyielding, she realized that her life had already changed. By morning, the whispers had already spread through Dry Creek like wildfire in tall grass. Someone had seen her. Someone always did. The shadow of her shawl, a flicker of firelight, a figure standing too close to a man who had no place in town. By sunrise, the stories had twisted into something uglier than the truth. Lila May woke to the sound of knocks against her thin door sharp, angry fists rattling the wood as though they meant to break it down. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders, her heart thudding, and cracked the door just enough to see Mrs. Yates stood there, the preacher's wife, her face pinched with righteous fury. Two other women flanked her, their bonnets pulled low, their eyes burning like coals. "You ought to be ashamed," Mrs. Yates hissed, spittle gathering at the corner of her mouth. "Lurking with him out there like some kind of harlot. You're a disgrace to every decent woman in this town." Before Lila May could answer, another woman spat at her boots. "Filthy," she muttered. "Don't you dare show your face in church again." The door slammed shut before the women could shove their way in. Lila May pressed her back against it, trembling. Shame clawed at her chest, but beneath it a strange spark of defiance flickered. For the first time in years she hadn't been alone. For the first time, someone had chosen to stand near her without fear, but the town would not forgive. By noon, the men had joined in. At the Mercantile, she heard them muttering, their voices low but sharp enough to cut. "That's what you get, letting him near your shack," one sneered. "She'd bring trouble to us all," another spit into the dirt. "Ought to run her out with him." The sheriff himself appeared at her porch by sundown. Sheriff Kane was a heavy man with a belly that stretched his vest, a man who wore authority, like a badge he didn't earn. His thumbs hooked into his belt as he leaned on her doorframe, smirking. "Girl," he drawled, "you best send that Injun on his way. Dry Creek don't take kindly to his kind hanging round. You want folks talking even worse about you, or worse acting on it?" Lila May's throat tightened, but before she could answer, a shadow moved behind her. The warrior stepped into the doorway. The sheriff's smirk faltered. For a moment, the man who'd made her life small and pitiful looked less sure of himself. The warrior didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply stood there tall, broad, shirtless despite the chill, the firelight from inside the shack brushing across his bronze skin and the turquoise beads at his chest. His presence filled the doorway like a wall of stone. The sheriff shifted, cleared his throat, and spat into the dirt. "This here ain't your fight," he muttered, eyes flicking nervously between them. "Best watch yourself." When he left, his boots crunching too quickly in the dirt, Lila May finally let her breath out. Her hands trembled, her heart thundering against her ribs. The warrior said nothing, but the way he placed his body between her and the world told her everything. But Dry Creek was not finished. That night, they came with torches. Lila May woke to the acrid scent of smoke seeping through the cracks in her shack. Her eyes flew open, and before she could gather her senses, a crash split the night, something striking against the wood. Flames licked the edges of her window, hungry and fast. Her chest clenched with terror. She stumbled toward the door, coughing, her hands clawing for the latch. The world spun in smoke and heat, her lungs burning. She thought this was the end, that the town had finally found a way to erase her for good, but then strong arms lifted her from the floor. The warrior carried her out into the night, his body cutting through the smoke as though it meant nothing. She gasped for air as the cool wind struck her face, but the relief was short-lived. Outside, men stood in the street, their faces twisted in rage, their torches blazing. "There she is," one shouted. "The witch and her savage." The crowd roared. The warrior set her gently on her feet behind him, then straightened to his full height. Firelight danced across his chest, casting him in bronze and shadow. His long black hair whipped. In the wind, his turquoise and bone necklaces gleaming. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His silence was more powerful than their shouting. His body became a wall, his stance a vow no one would touch her while he still breathed. And in that moment, with the smoke of her burning shack curling into the night sky, Lila May realized something terrifying and beautiful. She was no longer fighting alone. The night cracked open with fire and fury. The torches roared, their flames clawing at the dark sky, while the mob's shouts rolled across the prairie like thunder. "Hand him over." A voice barked, thick with anger. "He's no man of this town, he's a savage." Another spat, thrusting his torch higher. The young woman Clara pressed herself against the warrior's back, her fingers gripping the fabric of his sash as though he were her only anchor in a world tearing apart. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. She had never stood between men with weapons before, never defied the judgment of the town that had once been her cage. Yet here she was, trembling but refusing to let go of him. The warrior stood tall, his silhouette carved by firelight into something almost mythic. His bronze chest bore the marks of battles past, and his long black hair whipped wild in the desert wind. The turquoise and bone necklaces at his throat caught the flicker of flame, glinting like tiny stars. His voice, when it came, was low but carried with the weight of stone. "You've taken much from me already. You'll take nothing more tonight." The men hesitated, shifting on their boots. This was no cowering figure begging for mercy. This was a wall of muscle, scars, and unbroken spirit, a man who would not yield, even outnumbered. Still, the thirst for violence burned in their eyes. Clara's knees shook. She could see Mr. Halpern, the storekeeper who once turned her away when she begged for work. She could see Mrs. Weller's eldest boy who'd thrown stones at her when she walked past their porch. Every face in the mob was a face she knew, twisted into something monstrous under the torchlight. "Step aside, Clara," Halpern growled, his lip curling. "You don't know what you're defending. That man's not your kind. He doesn't belong." But Clara lifted her chin, voice breaking but defiant. "No man ever wanted to touch me. No man wanted me whole. And now I've found one who does. He belongs more than any of you." A silence followed, a silence heavier than gun smoke. The mob wavered, but only for a heartbeat. Rage thrives where reason falters. The first stone flew. It struck the dirt near the warrior's feet, scattering dust. Then came another, closer. Clara flinched, pressing tighter against him. The warrior raised his arm, not in fear but in warning. His tomahawk gleamed as he held it steady. The crowd stilled for a breath, the torchlight flickering across his broad shoulders. "I will not strike first," he said, voice rumbling like distant thunder. "But touch her and I'll strike last." The air thickened. The townsmen shifted, torn between their pride and the primal instinct that told them they stood against more than flesh and bone. They stood against a spirit that had endured fire, exile, and betrayal, and had not broken Dot behind him. Clara's tears fell silently, streaking down her dirt-smudged cheeks. For the first time, they weren't tears of shame or loneliness. They were tears of being seen, of being worth fighting for. The wind gusted, carrying sparks from the torches into the night. One flared and died in the dirt. Another wavered in its bearer's hand. Doubt seeped into the mob like water into cracked wood. Finally, one man muttered, "This ain't worth blood tonight." Another lowered his torch, then another. The spell of fury began to crumble, but not all. Some still clenched their fists, still seethed with a hatred that had nowhere else to go. The warrior felt Clara's trembling behind him. He stepped forward, just one stride, his body a shield between her and every man in front of them. "If you want me," he growled, "you'll have to step through fire. And you'll have to carry her screams with you till the grave." It was not a threat. It was a promise. The prairie night held its breath. The prairie was silent in the aftermath, save for the crackle of dying torches and the soft sound of the woman's breath as she clung to the warrior's arm. The mob, once bristling with fury, had scattered like frightened cattle, leaving only broken sticks and trampled dust in their wake. Their courage had melted beneath the unshakable fire in the warrior's eyes. Clara, her name whispered like a fragile thing, stared at him as though seeing him for the first time. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, though faint bruises and scratches marked his skin. In the glow of the moon, his figure seemed carved from the very earth, a living monument of strength. "You stood against them all," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "No man ever wanted to touch me," her voice broke, trembling with the weight of long-buried pain. "But you wanted me enough to face them all." The warrior turned to her, his dark eyes softened now, though still burning with something. "Fierce and eternal?" "Not just enough," he said, his voice deep and sure, carrying the gravity of mountains. "I wanted you more than their hatred, more than their fear, more than their torches could ever burn." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She had lived her life unseen, unloved, discarded like a rag no one claimed. Yet here stood a man who had taken on the whole weight of a town, not for pride, not for conquest, but for her. For the first time, she felt the warmth of being chosen. The prairie wind picked up, tugging at her shawl, lifting the warrior's long hair so it streamed behind him like a dark river. He lowered his weapon slowly, as though laying down more than just steel, laying down a life of fighting alone. "They'll come back," Clara whispered, though not with the fear she once carried. It was a simple truth. "They'll try again." The warrior's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Then let them. I will still stand." But as he said it, something shifted in Clara's chest. A realization as bright as dawn crept through her. This man could not always carry the fight alone. He had saved her, but perhaps she could save him too. She straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. The faint moonlight caught the determination in her face. "Then we'll stand together," she said, her voice firmer than it had ever been. "If the whole world doesn't want me, then the whole world can reckon with both of us." The warrior looked at her for a long moment, then nodded with the solemn respect of one acknowledging an equal. "Together," he echoed. The two stood in the hush of the prairie, side by side, her small figure shadowed against his tall, broad one. The firelight had faded, but the glow between them was brighter than any flame. Above them, the stars scattered across the endless sky, cold and eternal. And yet, down on the earth, two people had found something warmer than any star, the defiant truth that even the unwanted can be claimed, cherished, and fiercely defended. By dawn, word would spread of what had happened that night, of a lone warrior who stood against a mob for a woman no one else dared to touch. Some would call it madness. Others would call it legend. But for Clara, it was something far simpler. For the first time in her life, she was not invisible. She was not unwanted. She was seen. She was chosen. And for the warrior, it was not a battle. Lost or won, it was the beginning of something greater. For the first time, he was not standing alone. The prairie wind carried their vow into the horizon, scattering it like seeds across the land. Perhaps one day it would grow into a story told around campfires, or whispered in towns where people wondered if such love could ever be real. But for now, it was just the two of them, bruised but unbroken, scarred but alive, walking into the Phi, dawn together, and the warrior, glancing at her with a rare, quiet smile, spoke words she would never forget. They thought no man would ever want you, but I will want you enough for them all.